And in order to give our speaker as much time as possible, I'm just going to jump right into introducing Jamie Fly. So like I mentioned, Jamie, is my former boss at the Foreign Policy Initiative, which was a think tank in Washington, D.C., which focused on promoting the idea that the U.S. needs to be engaged and a leader in the world in every aspect, economically, diplomatically, militarily, et cetera. So he was the founding executive director of that. And I know you all have read his bio, but I will hit the high points. So currently, Jamie is a senior fellow and senior advisor to the president, working out of the Berlin, Germany office of the German Marshall Fund. And you all may recall last year that we had two of Jamie's colleagues speak at the Alice Stevens Center, Laura Rosenberger and Zach Cooper, speaking on a fairly similar topic, which is authoritarian interference in democracy. So for those of you that were there, this will be a nice follow-up to that conversation. So Jamie researches and speaks about transatlantic relations, US foreign policy, great power competition with Russia and China, and democracy and human rights. He previously served as president and CEO of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in Prague. And prior to that was, I already mentioned, co-director of the Alliance for Security and Democracy at GMF, as well as the director of the Future of Geopolitics and Asia programs. And then the one position I haven't mentioned so far is that he was also counselor on foreign affairs and national security to Senator Marco Rubio. And we can thank Jamie for helping us get together our folks who spoke on the current conflict in Nagorno-Karabakh. So his former colleagues at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty gave us a really great, really interesting, candid overview of what they're seeing on the ground in the region. And, you know, it was obviously a contentious thing to talk about, even between two people working for the same organization. So thank you, Jamie, for that. But so you all know Jamie's here to speak to us about press freedom, disinformation. Of course, we'll be speaking about Eurasia, which is, you know, the main area where Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty works. But I think we'll hopefully have time to delve into press freedom issues around the world and maybe even at home and talk about our current political situation. But with that, I will hand it over to Jamie. Let me remind everyone, you can ask questions either in the chat box is fine or in the Q&A box. So please do that. We've already had a couple come through to me via email. And I should also mention to Jamie that it looks like we have some folks from our local independent news media from WBHM, which is our NPR affiliate. We have some folks on the line. We have some folks as well from our Department of Commerce. Thank you all for being here. And we also have some former colleagues. I think Caitlin Poling and Ellen Bork are joining this call. So we're looking to them for some great questions. All right, with that, I will turn it over to Jamie. Thanks again for being with us.
Great, thanks a lot, Callie, for organizing this. And I regret that we're not able to do this in person. I have actually never been to Alabama. And when you initially reached out to me, I think in 2019 about coming down, I was really looking forward to it. But then I ended up moving to Prague instead. So I'll talk a little bit about primarily my work at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, and I'll break it up into three sections. I want to first talk a bit about just the role that information is currently playing in our societies, which obviously relates to a free press. I'm going to talk then a bit about what the situation looks like across Eurasia. I mean, I think you all probably have your own views about the information environment in the United States right now, and I'm happy to talk about that in the Q&A if you want. But I'll describe what the landscape looks like across Eurasia that an organization like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty is dealing with. And then I'll talk more about kind of how RFERL plays a role and in that landscape and kind of pushing back against some of the negative trends we've seen in the information landscape. First, on the importance of information, and I'll start off just by talking about how I started working on this issue. I have a pretty traditional, for Washington, policy, national security background, moving in and out of government between different administrations, Capitol Hill, and think tanks. And it was in my last government job, when I was an advisor to Senator Marco Rubio for 4 years, including through his presidential run, where I started to notice some shifts in the information landscape in the US and how it was affecting American politics. Obviously, that was the election where Donald Trump won the Republican primary and ultimately the presidency. And it was marked by a lot of engagement in the election online through social media. Now, social media had started much earlier, but I think 2016 was the election where social media really played a predominant role in the political discourse. Some of that was President Trump's own use of social media, but across the political spectrum, it played a significant role. And after the election, when I went to the German Marshall Fund and met Laura Rosenberger, who was in the same election, Hillary Clinton's foreign policy advisor, and we began to just kind of discuss our shared experiences, we started to realize that the social media, the role of social media in those debates was in one part positive. It was a platform where any American, no matter what their day job was or what their status was in society, could contribute to the debate. But that kind of leveling of the information playing field created its own vulnerabilities. And we later learned that those vulnerabilities were exploited by some foreign actors, including Russia in the 2016 campaign. And there were a lot of concerning aspects of it, especially given that the social media platforms, I think, had not up to that point thought through the consequences of some of the structures of their platforms, and not really looked at ways to ensure that information was being shared on an equitable basis across the platform, and that the system could not be gamed, which there was some evidence that various malign actors had tried to do as part of the political debate. So that's how I initially got interested in this topic. And that examination, especially of the vulnerabilities that allowed foreign actors to try to influence the American political process, is what ultimately led me to Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And I'll talk more a bit about what RFERL does on a daily basis. But I saw RFERL as a perhaps underutilized tool of the United States, given that its mission is to support strong independent media in societies where it does not otherwise exist. And so that's why I ended up moving to Prague to lead the organization. So RFERL in its modern incarnation has 23, covers 23 countries, 27 language services across Eurasia. And it basically stretches across Russia, through Central Asia, up into the western border of China, down into Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, and then back up through Europe and through the Balkans, and up through parts of Central Europe, including up to Belarus. And so it's a pretty broad territory. Our audience total is basically 38 million people across those 23 countries. And you might ask, well, why is the amount not higher? Which is something I got asked in a congressional testimony a few months ago. And that's in large part due to government censorship and the efforts to block Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's access to the audience. If you looked at the population of that Eurasian territory, it would be much more significant. And so one constant challenge is trying to circumvent government controls and make sure that the journalism that Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty produces is able to be is accessible by as many people as possible. What we've seen across Eurasia is, I think, a very similar state of affairs to much of the developing world. Independent media is under assault. These are countries where there are either no acceptance of democratic norms and institutions, or they're very shaky at best. Groups like Freedom House have described Eurasia as long one of the worst performing regions in the world when it comes to press freedom. But beyond just the state of the rule of law and democracy in these countries, the state of media is similar to a number of the challenges that media faces in the United States, even in Western Europe, in countries like Germany, where I sit right now. Market forces have really made it difficult for independent media to survive, even when governments allow it space to operate. What am I talking about with market forces? Well, in the United States, we've seen this trend with local media under pressure because of a loss of advertising revenue, as the sort of classified advertising that used to dominate newspapers or even radio in much of the US has all shifted online to websites, originally Craigslist, but now there are many other options where that advertising is basically free. So that economic driver support for the media has disappeared. Online journalism, which is often less local, has often drawn eyeballs away from local media. And a trend we've seen less in the United States, but more in parts of Central Europe and further east, has also then been that wealthy individuals with a particular political agenda or a corporate agenda often have stepped in and taken over media and really turned them into propaganda outlets. And so a challenge you have across much of Eurasia in some cases is outright government propaganda networks. So think the traditional Soviet-style propaganda networks that were often discussed in the West during the Cold War. Those still exist in places like Russia or in Central Asia, where you'll have literally state TV, which is often one of the few accessible channels, which has significant resources, which obviously does not provide an honest account of what's going on in that society, but provides a very biased set of reporting about government policies, and is usually run by some apparatchik, sometimes a family member of government officials. But even when you don't have to deal with official state media, you have this trend of what I've called oligarchic media. And so wealthy individuals who either for their own private corporate interests or for some sort of alliance they have with a friend who may be a government official will purchase media outlets and then skew the coverage in a particular direction. Sometimes they'll make them a very partisan outlet, think some of the partisan media in the US on steroids. Or the other thing I saw across some of our coverage area was that they would take them offline, basically. They wouldn't shut down the station entirely, but they would turn a respected news outlet into a 24/7 entertainment network or a 24/7 sports network. And so they'll shift the focus away from topics that might be sensitive for the government. So this is the sort of landscape that Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty operates in. The one final thing I'll say about that environment is that independent media outlets that are able to find funding, that are able to find journalists who are willing to work for them, because often they don't have significant resources, and there might be more lucrative resources by going to one of these oligarchic media or state media. The independent media that do thrive or do try to survive often face direct pressure. So we have a debate in the US about the president's attacks on media or politicians' criticism of journalists. Well, again, take that times 10. So it's not just that politicians are attacking journalists, it's that journalists are being called in the middle of the night by state security services saying, we know what you're reporting on. If you should think about the future of your children, think about the future, and sometimes they'll know the name of their son or their daughter. Think about their future before you decide whether to file that story. Or sometimes the security services will physically harass these journalists when they're out doing their day-to-day reporting. That is the sort of pressure that independent media face in these countries when they can get past all of those market and political forces that I talked about earlier. So it's not an easy environment in which to be a journalist, to provide objective news and information. But it's an incredibly important environment for independent media, because in a media landscape like that, especially now that we're moving into the digital age, including in many developing countries, what happens when you don't have independent media is you have basically a disinformation zone. So the sort of disinformation conspiracy theories that we see in segments of the Western social media landscape, in a country where you have no independent media, no objective source of information, that is a disinformation, I call it a disinformation proliferated environment, where really all that people get access to if they're online are rampant disinformation, lies, sometimes from their own government, sometimes from private actors with an agenda, but also from external actors. And the major ones operating in Eurasia are primarily Russia, given the Soviet past and the connection that many of these countries had, as they were many of them were part of the Soviet Union or part of the Warsaw Pact. But also increasingly China, which is growing in its role across the region and slowly starting to invest its own energy into the information space. And so this is not a positive environment either for the citizens of those countries who are trying to have access to information to make informed decisions about their day-to-day lives. And it's also not a positive environment for the United States, because a lot of this disinformation, especially that propagated by Russia and China, is often directed at us, at America's role in that country, at America's role in the world, and trying to undermine confidence in the United States. So that's the broader picture about what the information landscape looks like across Eurasia. So how does Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty play a role in tackling that challenge? Well, just a little bit about the history, and apologies if some of you joined the previous conversation with my former colleagues and they talked about this. Radio Free Europe and Radio Liberty, they originally were two separate institutions headquartered here in Germany, originally in Munich. They were set up at the beginning of the Cold War by the United States government with an effort to provide, a platform to exiles from the Eastern Bloc countries, which was Radio Free Europe, and from the Soviet Union, which was broadcasting to through Radio Liberty, to basically have a mic and speak to their fellow countrymen who were being oppressed behind the Iron Curtain, providing an honest account of what was going on inside those societies, and also speaking frankly about the West. Originally, these were set up as committees of private Americans to support this project. It was later revealed about 3 decades later that a lot of the original funding came from the Central Intelligence Agency, although there's a historical debate by people who have reviewed the records from the radios about how much editorial control the CIA ever really exercised. The historians that I've talked to don't find a whole lot of evidence that there was kind of direct day-to-day control of the messaging, because honestly, if you look at some of the old recordings, you can see why there was probably very little reason for the US government to control the message, because they really just handed over mics to people who had just fled these horrible regimes, who wanted to speak frankly about the situation in those countries. And it was a powerful message, even without any US government interference in the scripting of that messaging. So they broadcast initially via radio throughout the Cold War from transmitters often located here in Germany, but as close to the border as possible. There was extensive jamming throughout the Cold War of their signals. I think the radio broadcasts were viewed as quite effective by the communist era regimes. Otherwise, I don't think they would have bothered to try to block the signals. And over the years, over the decades, they developed a significant following behind the Iron Curtain. So much so that even when I was president of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, decades later, I would still meet listeners who are now aging in their 60s and 70s, but at the time were children, who would kind of tear up as they talked to me about their memories of sitting around the radio with their family in communist Czechoslovakia or Bulgaria, or even in the Soviet Union itself, trying to find the signal through the static to listen to broadcasters, many of whom they remembered by name decades later. And there was a deep emotional attachment that the radio's programming formed with listeners. And over time, over the decades, they developed a significant market share in many of these countries, which is quite admirable today, where every single media company around the world struggles to develop a significant following because of the fragmented nature of our media landscape, where you have every consumer, again, even in some of the most remote countries in the world, have a lot of choice. Usually, you can get your news through radio, still in some places TV, but you can also go online in most countries where the internet's not blocked and have extensive access. But in some of the Eastern Bloc countries, by 1989, obviously when the Berlin Wall came down, Radio Free Europe had greater than 50% market share in a number of those countries. A lot of the opposition figures who led those revolutions in 1989, people like Lech Walesa, Václav Havel, were often interviewed by the radios. They listened to the radios. They used the radios to communicate with the general public, especially during key moments of protest or uncertainty. And after the events of 1989, each of those leaders spoke out publicly about the role that the radios played in those key events, and very emotionally thanked the United States for supporting this project. By 1989, the radios were funded overtly, so no longer supported by the Central Intelligence Agency, but starting in the 1970s, they were funded overtly by the US Congress. And ever since the 1970s, they've had a governance structure where they remain non-governmental institutions, private corporations, but they are overseen by a federal agency. It's called the US Agency for Global Media, and the Secretary of State plays a role in conducting some of that oversight. And I'm happy to discuss that in more detail if it's of interest in the Q&A. But one of the key key issues in recent decades has been ensuring that the radios, although they receive government funding, are walled off from the government more clearly than they were in their early decades, to ensure that they have the ability to report on whatever topic they want, that they don't take positions that are in line necessarily with any one US administration, because they need to be advancing the role of reporting the truth wherever it leads, even if it reports things that may not be the best types of reporting about governments that might be allies or friends of the US. And so that's the overarching approach that RFERL takes to this day, is just doing solid reporting in the countries it operates. Increasingly over the years, it obviously has moved well beyond radio. RFERL still does a lot of radio, especially in countries like Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iran, and that's primarily because those are still significant radio cultures. And also it's often easier to circumvent some of the attempts at blocking the content via radio. But today, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty is a multimedia news organization, just like BBC and others, which is on multiple platforms. Several years prior to me joining, the radios really went through a transformation to doing more TV, and they now have a 24/7 Russian language TV network called Current Time, which you can kind of think of as like a Russian language CNN that broadcasts both news, documentaries, a little bit of entertainment from primarily the headquarters in Prague, but also through reporters operating across Central Asia, Ukraine, and also in a bureau in Russia. The radios are forward deployed, which kind of sets them apart from a lot of other international news organizations. They have more than 20 bureaus. So ideally, the radios operate in country wherever they can do so, they can have journalists operating safely. And that gives them a leg up that many others who are trying to report on some of these sensitive countries from abroad aren't able to compete with. And it adds credibility to their reporting as well, because their audiences often know that these are their fellow citizens on the ground trying to report on sensitive topics. The new trend, obviously, in recent years, and something I try to prioritize during my time as president, is really digital. And that's where I think RFERL will be the most impactful in the decades to come. And they are active on pretty much every major digital platform, customized according to the country in which they're operating, because social media culture varies widely from one country to the next. You know, just as one example, I'm not just talking about being on Facebook or YouTube with video. RFERL services have very adroitly used platforms like Instagram to tell news, which before I first was briefed by our Iran team, which is the one that was kind of pioneering this, because in Iran, Instagram is the only major Western social media platform that is not banned, and it's accessible. And so Iranians have turned to it to get news and information from the outside world. But they smartly have come up with a way to use images and graphics to tell complex news stories using Instagram. And so that's the sort of trend, especially in some of the closed spaces where they operate. They'll use whatever tool, whatever platform necessary to reach their audience, to make sure that they are meeting their audience on that platform, rather than requiring their audience to kind of search them out. I'll wrap up my initial comments, and then we can open it up by talking just briefly about a couple challenges that RFERL is facing right now. The most recent, which I lived through the first part of it there in Prague, is obviously the pandemic. The pandemic has been a significant challenge for news organizations around the globe. It's been especially chaotic for an organization like RFERL, though, which operates across countries that have not handled the pandemic well. We're talking about developing countries in Central Asia, which do not have the healthcare capacity, countries like Russia, where they also have significant problems in their healthcare system, and all governed by governments who, let's just say, are pretty fast and loose with the facts and are unwilling to have an honest dialogue with their citizens about what is actually going on in a public health crisis. And so RFERL, I think, has played a key role in many of those countries in exposing government falsehoods about the pandemic. We've had some governments, Lukashenko, the leader of Belarus, even prior to the protests and the election in August that led to the protests, you know, he's a perfect example, tried to deny that the pandemic even existed, that coronavirus was a thing, would sometimes tell his citizens that you could kind of inoculate yourself from it if you just drank a lot more vodka. Things, you know, recommendations from government officials which actually are harmful if people take them seriously. And so media and an outlet like Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty in a place like Belarus plays an important role in providing the facts, providing basic information about a pandemic, providing public health information from the CDC, WHO about how to protect yourself and your family, exposing failed government efforts to tackle the pandemic, telling personal stories of people who got sick and tried to seek a test or had to be hospitalized and had to deal with corruption in the hospital system. So those are just a few examples. The other thing externally, beyond what was going on in the countries, RFERL played an important role in sharing the facts about the origins of the virus. Obviously, there was a global propaganda campaign by China, by Russia, to spread disinformation about the supposed beginnings of the virus, some blaming the United States, others like China, in addition, just trying to put a positive gloss on their handling of the virus and their supposed willingness to help other countries. RFERL, you know, covered the response of countries like Russia and China, but did so factually, pointed out when they were lying, highlighted when the equipment that they were providing was either very costly to certain countries or when they provided faulty equipment and it didn't work. Things that often the government sponsored media in those countries and the Russian or Chinese sponsored media were not willing to cover. So RFERL has had a busy year covering the pandemic while also trying to protect its own journalists. And it's just an important reminder that in a pandemic like this, journalists are often also kind of frontline responders. They can't always just sit at home, report on the story. They need to get out, investigate, talk to sources, go to hospitals. And so a number of RFERL colleagues have gotten sick, and unfortunately one in Kyrgyzstan actually passed away from coronavirus. So the pandemic has been a significant challenge. The second challenge I'll highlight is just the pressure that journalists across Eurasia are under. And it's always been a problem in recent decades, but from what I can tell, I think the pressure is increasing. Governments, and sometimes now because they feel that they might be put at risk because of public unrest related to that pandemic, they are clamping down. They're trying to enact new legislation limiting media. In Russia, where RFERL has several hundred journalists, there's been a slow progression of the Russian authorities trying to criminalize RFERL's journalism, threaten RFERL freelancers. If you work for this foreign agent, Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty, you could face potential fines, eventual imprisonment. Just several weeks ago, I was told by my old team at RFERL, a public website was put up actually publicizing personal information about a lot of RFERL journalists, their private home addresses, the names of their family members, some of whom still live in Russia. These sorts of scare tactics have increased significantly. In some countries, there's been direct threats to their lives. Actually, just today, sadly, I was told that one of RFERL's journalists in Afghanistan was assassinated. He was covering a story in Helmand province related, which is a scene of a significant Taliban stronghold, and someone drove up to his car, put a bomb on the car while it was driving, and he unfortunately was killed. When I was president, we lost 3 young Belarusian documentary filmmakers, thankfully not, as far as we could tell, in a targeted killing, but just in a car accident as they were driving out to make a documentary about some of the pandemic response. I mean, these are journalists who are taking risks on a daily basis just to do their jobs, just to report for their audiences. And those dangers are unfortunately becoming increasingly routine across much of Eurasia. The final challenge before I open it up for the conversation is that in addition to operating in some of these incredibly difficult environments like Russia, like Afghanistan, like Pakistan, countries where honestly, to be competitive in the media space, to provide the journalists with the resources they need, you probably could set up an entire media company in just one of those countries, funded at the same level that Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty is. We're facing a decline in media freedom in places that I think we in the United States and in Europe thought had already advanced. Some of the former Soviet satellite states from the Eastern Bloc. So the trend in the last several years has been that RFERL has actually been asked to reopen services in countries that it left after 1989. And prior to my joining the company, we had relaunched services in Romania and Bulgaria because of the decline in press freedom in those countries. And I led the planning for a relaunch of our service in Hungary, which just started again several months ago. This has been a challenge. I think it's an important role that RFERL is playing in those countries, and we still have significant brand ID. We can play a useful role, but this is complex on multiple levels. Number one, it diverts resources from some of the tougher media environments that I was talking about earlier. And also, even though these countries are suffering when it comes to media diversity, they're advanced democracies. They're part of NATO. They're part of the European Union. They have much more advanced media landscapes. So when a company like RFERL moves back in, it's not an easy undertaking. We're not moving into Tajikistan, another place we operate, where we set up shop and we're really the only major independent media. In a country like Hungary or Romania or Bulgaria, there are still other options. And so it means that we have to compete and we have to find our niche in that media market. And that can also often be a difficult challenge, especially on a shoestring budget, which is what RFERL has usually been given to set up these new services. And so one of the tensions that RFERL is dealing with is kind of how do you continue to push media freedom into some of the most difficult operating environments, while still now being asked to return to places that need your support, but quite frankly, where there are a lot of other options and a lot of other competition. And so anyways, I'll end there, but that's just a kind of snapshot of some of the issues that RFERL is facing in the modern media landscape. So look forward to your questions.
Awesome. Thank you, Jamie. So folks, you can type questions, and then we've got some questions that have come in. I did want to ask, I don't know if the Hungary office has already opened for the one that you had put together, but are there other plans to expand more into Europe? And then I guess if you have any, I'd be curious to know any specific kind of success stories from the time you were there in certain countries where you either broke news that nobody else was speaking about, and just kind of like get some descriptions of some of the successes that y'all have had.
Yeah, both good questions. So expansion. So when I was president, I tried to avoid this question at all costs, not because, again, I didn't think that RFERL could be impactful in new markets, but the reality is that RFERL has been operating with a roughly flat budget for the last several years, and had been increasingly asked to do more with the same budget, and it just wasn't sustainable. And so as the leader of the organization, my message when I got asked this in Washington by Congress or by State Department was always to say, we can do more, but if that's the case, we need to be given more funding. I did make a trip about a year ago, a little under a year ago, actually, to Warsaw. Poland is the country in Europe that's mentioned the most as kind of a potential next problematic situation where you could have a degradation of the media landscape. And I met with some of the independent media that still operate in Poland. And I came away, again, this information was about 11 months ago, so things have changed a bit, but I came away with the sense that Poland is still in a much better place than a number of the countries where RFERL has recently returned to. There are independent outlets that do, yes, they face kind of public pressure from the political class, but they don't face the sort yet of kind of the economic targeting and the outright harassment that I talked about earlier in a number of the other countries. So I guess a long way of saying, I hope that RFERL doesn't need to go into any of those countries. As a president, and I think my predecessors always like to say that in our business at RFERL, our hope was that we could leave more countries. I mean, the whole point of us operating is that we want to be helping the democratization effort, succeed to the point where we're no longer needed, where there's a vibrant independent media without the US Congress helping to support it. One final thing I'll say about Europe, and I had started these conversations a bit, and I've continued them as a think tank scholar, is I've been trying to encourage the Europeans to do more in this space. The European Union, although it has significant resources and supports independent media outside of the EU, has been very reluctant to look at the independent media landscape within its own member states because of the political sensitivity. I think that at this point is ridiculous. There's no reason that it should be up to US funded media to be the kind of bulwark standing there helping to defend the independent media space. This could be a collaborative project between the United States and some of the European broadcasters. And so I think a lot more needs to be done for the Europeans to start not just supporting independent media on the periphery, which they already do, but including inside the European Union. On impact, there were all kinds of impact stories almost every week, and pretty much every week we had impact stories. When I was there, our newly launched Bulgarian language service which operates on a tiny budget. And I visited the bureau in Sofia with a skeletal staff of less than 10 people working out of basically an apartment as their office. They did groundbreaking investigative reporting into corruption at the highest levels of the Bulgarian government. Their reporting led to the resignation of multiple government ministers. And they obviously, they started the political conversation that led to these resignations. And that sort of thing is common across RFERL's coverage area. In Central Asia, which doesn't get a lot of attention, I think, unfortunately in the United States, but is a real key region and will be increasingly so because of its proximity to China, because of Chinese investment and influence, and because of the significant market share that RFERL has in many of those countries. We have an outsized influence in a place like Kyrgyzstan. You might have seen in the news occasionally in recent months. A lot of this political turmoil is because of RFERL journalism. While I was there, the team had started even before I got there, but continued some groundbreaking investigative reporting into high-level corruption that had siphoned off, by some accounts, perhaps more than $1 billion from the Kyrgyz state authorities, which in Kyrgyzstan, which is a poor country, is a huge amount of money that could have been much better spent for the Kyrgyz people. And their reporting on this, along with some partner media organizations, has been explosive in Kyrgyz politics, in part led to some of the protests that have now led to the president to resign. So that's just one example. With protest reporting is something that RFERL does throughout in places like Russia, where you see protests against the Putin regime. They've been on the front lines covering the protests post-election in Belarus. They've had their reporters jailed occasionally because they've been out there day after day covering the protests. And when you ask about impact, my one final anecdote, which is my favorite, I visited Moscow, and our team, very amazing group of journalists in Moscow who operate under significant pressure in Russia. I visited them in January of this year. And as part of my meetings, I went to see Kremlin officials. I met with Vladimir Putin's spokesman. And in the meeting, as I was making our concerns known about the treatment of our journalists and about our interest in just being able to access more of the Russian audience, as I was describing what we've been doing recently, he held up his hand and said, "Please stop. We know very well the success that you have had, especially with young Russians covering issues." And so I saw that as the highest form of flattery when the Kremlin had taken note, because that's always obviously a concern. Is, are we being impactful enough? Are we hard-hitting enough? Are government attempts to censor or block access to our information succeeding? But even in places like Russia, where it's a rather bleak picture, on digital platforms, online, we've had a significant ability to reach new audiences and to provide content that they have no access to otherwise from Russian state media.
Okay. Two of our board members have asked very similar questions. So I'm going to go with Chuck's question. Chuck and Henry Frozen asked similar questions. So, and Chuck Holmes, by the way, is he's the manager of our local NPR affiliate, WBHM. So here's his question, and this gets a little bit into US politics. So I hope everybody's ready for that. Okay. Jamie, how secure is the firewall for journalists at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty? I noticed a piece, a web piece a day or two ago examining international reaction to Secretary Pompeo's partisan statement about the US election. It was a good, solid piece of journalism, and one that I can assume the Trump administration wouldn't particularly consider favorable. Is RFE-RL facing the same kind of friction with Michael Pack that VOA has encountered? Maybe you'll want to tell a little bit about that last question so people understand what he's referring to.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier the governance structure above RFERL as a private institution, but one that receives annual funding from the US Congress. And the Congress ultimately, which has written a statute that authorizes RFERL and its sister networks. One is Voice of America, but Voice of America is actually part of a federal agency. Its journalists receive a federal paycheck, which is not the case with RFERL. Voice of America also has a statutory mission, which goes back actually a little bit before RFERL, at the early days of the Cold War. VOA's mission is also to tell America's story. So it has that added, not just doing what we call surrogate journalism, being on the ground, covering stories in a local country, but VOA is also supposed to be explaining American policy to the world. And a lot of its staff actually are journalists based in DC who cover the Pentagon, the State Department, Congress, do interviews with policymakers, and then a variety of languages broadcast those to the world. RFER also has other surrogate partners like Radio Free Asia, which is a similar mission but focuses on China and other parts of Asia, and Middle East Broadcasting Network, which is an Arabic network focused on the Middle East. So these networks all are funded through this federal agency. And the reason I'm talking to you here from Berlin rather than sitting in my office in Prague is that there was a new agency head confirmed by the Senate in June, a Trump administration appointee named Michael Pack, who's a conservative filmmaker. And he was confirmed after a 2-year wait to get that confirmation from the Senate. And his first act of business was to exercise some powers he had been given in a recent change to the statute, and to remove all of the network heads en masse. So he fired all of us on his first day in the office without cause, and he claimed, he had nothing against any of us or what we were doing at the networks, but that he wanted to start with a clean slate. Since then, he's taken a number of controversial steps to show that he wants to exert more control, especially over the coverage of Voice of America, which, as I've noted before, has this mission of telling America's story and has come under some criticism in the past from those on the right who believe that it's taken a too critical stance towards the Trump administration. So Mr. Pack has been accused by some Voice of America staff of meddling in their coverage, of trying to influence their coverage in an improper way that violates something that we've called over the last several decades in US international broadcasting, the firewall, which is supposed to separate the funders and the federal officials who conduct oversight over the agency from the actual journalists. He repealed a regulation which related to this firewall, which raised a lot of concerns about his intentions. And so it's all a long way of saying is he's made a number of concerning moves, which I think have alarmed a lot of the journalists across the networks, not just at Voice of America, but also at Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And his actions have now provoked a lot of scrutiny. I've testified in front of the US House of Representatives. A number of us who previously worked at these broadcasters have been engaged in that public conversation about how to protect the journalists from political interference. And I think this is going to be an issue that the Biden administration is going to want to look at early on. Mr. Pack, given that he was appointed by Donald Trump, will likely leave office by January 20th or on January 20th. And so you then have new leadership of that agency, and I think they'll be looking to shore up some of these protections. When it comes to RFERL, and you noted that story, I'll just say I'm not sitting there every day monitoring the newsroom, so I can't say for sure what has or has not happened, but I've watched very closely what they've put out, and I see them on a daily basis producing hard-hitting journalism, no holds barred, including reporting on US policy on occasion. And so I have seen no signs of political influence by Mr. Pack of Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty. And I think it's something that would be concerning if it did happen. I mean, we need to make sure that the firewall, which preserves the credibility of these networks with their audiences. These are our audiences, just like during the Cold War. They know that these outlets are funded by the US government, but they know that these outlets are set up by the US government to report the truth. Our audiences do not see these outlets as propaganda, US propaganda. They understand that our journalists are free to report and follow the story wherever it leads them. And it's incredibly important that we preserve their credibility. Otherwise, we'll lose the audiences, and then there's no point in us even the US Congress funding this sort of broadcasting if we can't maintain the audience. And then the final thing, which I testified to, is when you politicize or you attempt to politicize the journalism, you put the journalists at risk. These are journalists, as I talked about earlier, who many of them are already risking their lives. They're already being harassed by security services. They're being accused of being spies just because, even though they're from the countries they're reporting on, but because they work for a congressionally funded network, they're often accused of being intelligence agents. And so if you blur those lines and you disregard the firewall, you're making it much easier for those hostile regimes to target these journalists and to put lives at risk, which is something which I think that unfortunately Mr. Pak doesn't seem to understand or has not understood based on some of his public statements. So it's been a rocky 6 months in U.S. international broadcasting. But I think there's some hope that there'll be some much needed reforms next year to shore up these protections that the networks have enjoyed for the last several decades.
Okay, we have a couple really good questions left. I know we're running up on our 1 hour mark, but this question is from one of our members, Will Ratliff, and you had mentioned Poland earlier, so bringing that back. He asks, what is the best policy change for the USA to adopt in order to counter both authoritarian actors like Putin that attempt to undermine democracy globally and the emerging aspiring autocrats in places like Poland and Hungary? So policy suggestions, I think, is what we're getting at here.
I think beyond supporting independent media, which is an important part of it, if things deteriorate to such an extent that these publics need more choice, then I do think there's a role for congressionally funded U.S. international broadcasting. But before we get to that point, I'd like to see the U.S. government, and I think this happens to a certain extent, but it's kind of waxed and waned depending on the administration. I don't think it's been a priority at the highest levels of the Trump administration. I think the U.S. administration should make independent media, the ability of civil society to operate, human rights in these countries, especially U.S. allies, it should be a high-level part of the conversation. Poland is a security partner of the United States. When the United States Secretary of State or the U.S. President raises an issue with a Polish counterpart, it gets taken seriously. I mean, we're not talking about China here. We're not talking about Putin or Central Asian autocrat. I mean, these are close partners. And I'm not saying it always needs to be public condemnation, but it certainly needs to be raised at the highest levels privately as a start. And if you don't make progress then maybe you go public. And I think often we as the US are often far too reluctant to prioritize these sorts of issues in the dialogue with our closest partners. And so I think there just needs to be much more conversation about certain politicization of the media not being acceptable for a NATO ally or an EU member state, and pointing out the dangers of it, because it's not just the dangers domestically. As I talked about at the beginning, it creates openings for foreign actors like Russia who will come in and exploit the situation and use that changed media landscape to push propaganda, to push disinformation. And so I think just more high-level political engagement is a good place to start.
Okay, we have a question from Caitlin now, and this goes back to our domestic politics a little bit, but you touched on the role of social media platforms in your remarks at your HVAC testimony. What impact do you think we will see on the spread of disinformation domestically from the move of so many Americans from Facebook to the Parler platform?
That's a good question. This is a thorny issue on multiple levels. So first I'll say, I think, and I've always said this even before I was at RFERL, I saw it more when I was at RFERL, the social media platforms need to play a much greater role, not in banning content. I mean, often this gets described in certain camps as, well, you just want to censor. You want someone in Silicon Valley to sit there and tell you, and to tell us, the average American or average user, what can and cannot be said online. That's not what this is about. The companies have created platforms which essentially are making editorial decisions on a second-by-second basis about what everyone using them will see, and that's being done through the algorithms. There is next to no algorithm transparency. Most Americans have no clue why certain material shows up at the top of their news feed And on most platforms, most users have very little ability to control what they see on their news feed. They can make changes on the margins, but they don't have full control because the platforms want to reserve that to tie into the way that they monetize the platforms and they sell advertising and the targeting of individuals and pushing certain information to you. The platforms, I think, also honestly haven't been careful enough about their algorithms, because we've seen time and again, whether it relates to hate speech, relates to horrific content related to child abuse or others, the algorithms are out of control. It pushes the most extreme information to users and creates a snowball effect where extreme content just gathers more and more followers, more and more people are being shown it, and factual content just kind of dies on the platform. And so there needs to be a lot more conversation about some of those issues between government, between the platforms, and honestly, between the users and the platforms, because users should assert, I think, their interest more in having more control. Caitlin raises an important dynamic now, though, because of some frustration in certain political quarters, especially on the right now in recent months, about the platforms and about so-called shadow banning, about restricting some content, labeling of some content, some of the president's tweets, et cetera. Some people are just deciding to leave the platforms, and there are new platforms being set up that are supposedly conservative friendly, where they say that they're free speech platforms where they won't limit any content. That's not a great solution either, because what you often see in certain groups is then extreme content will migrate to those platforms. And you also have a fragmented social media environment, which is not ideal either, because it'll kind of fragment our society even more in our political conversations. So ultimately, I think that government needs to play a role. I'm supportive of some additional regulation by government, and I think that's going to be the interesting space if you have a Biden administration working with a Republican-controlled Senate, because the discontent with the platforms is growing on both the left and the right. And I think we may be reaching the point where there's broader bipartisan support for at least some sort of regulation that limits maybe how the platforms structure their platforms and how they use the algorithms, or maybe require them to show more transparency to their users about the algorithms. And so it's just a kind of nascent conversation, and the platforms obviously are going to fight a lot of that, especially if it relates to new regulation. But I think it's something that has some potential in the next several years, even if we have divided government.
Okay, and I have another question, switching gears just a little bit. From your view in Berlin and previously in Prague, curious to get your take on the future. I mean, this is a huge question, but the future of transatlantic ties and the relationship under a Biden administration. What do you see as, just guessing, big differences, a return to Obama era, norms? Just curious to get your take on that from, and maybe the Europeans' perspective that you're hearing in Berlin.
Sure. Here in Germany, and in many parts of Western Europe, obviously there was no love lost for Donald Trump. It's been a rocky 4 years when it comes to the transatlantic relationship. Again, I'll start off by talking about mostly Western Europe. Frustrations with Donald Trump's unilateralism, and some of these were themes that I served in the George W. Bush administration, so it was similar complaints that Europeans had about the Bush administration, the unilateralism of the Trump administration, his withdrawal from some international organizations and agreements, first and foremost the Paris Climate Agreement, but also more recently his decision to remove the US from the World Health Organization after the pandemic began. Withdrawal from the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action with Iran, the Iran nuclear deal. These have all been irritants. His targeting of the EU in the trade arena, major frustrations. Having said that, so I think Joe Biden presenting a different face already talking about how he wants to work with allies and partners will be very well received over here. And many Western Europeans are breathing a sigh of relief. I think, though, that positive reaction masks some deeper structural changes in the transatlantic relationship that many Europeans have not grappled with yet. These shifts started well before Donald Trump. President Obama was also beloved in most parts of Western Europe. But the US and many parts of Europe was seen as starting to disengage from Europe. Remember, the focus on Asia and China started under the Obama administration. It initially was framed as a pivot to Asia that worried a lot of European allies. President Obama was very reluctant to get involved in the Middle East. That bothered a lot of European partners, especially France, and then countries along the Mediterranean who had to deal with the refugee crisis caused by the civil war in Syria. A lot of Central European partners were deeply suspicious of the Obama administration in the early years because President Obama tried his reset with Russia, which the Central Europeans viewed as going over their heads to negotiate directly with the Great Bear who was threatening them firsthand. And then we later saw, obviously, Russia's intervention in Ukraine and annexation of Crimea, all happening on his watch. So the European views of the United States, I think, are still a bit uncertain. I think there's maybe some hope that Joe Biden will be a reassertion of American leadership, but I think they look at American politics right now, and rightfully so, with President Trump not yet willing to concede, with many Republicans standing by President Trump, not appearing to be ready to work with Joe Biden, and they worry that American politics are going to hinder President Biden from returning America to this global leadership role. And then also, if you have a discussion between observers in Warsaw, Berlin, and Paris right now, they'll give you three different perspectives on a Biden administration, and not all will be all that positive, because some in Central Europe actually had very good relations with the Trump administration and felt that President Trump, despite his rhetoric about NATO, did a lot on the ground to shore up the alliance. They were happy that he was calling out free riders like Germany and forcing them to start paying more, which has been an irritant even within NATO and within some European allies. Mm-hmm. So it's a mixed bag, but all in all, I think everyone will want to give President Biden time and space and to start engaging, and then they'll just have to see how much in terms of tangible results Biden administration is really able to deliver, given a lot of the domestic debates that are still going to be raging back in Washington.
Got it. All right. Well, it's been about an hour, so I try to keep us within that hour. But thank you so much, Jamie, for being here with our group. This was an awesome conversation, and I hope that maybe next year we can actually have you in Birmingham, or we can just keep doing Zoom. But thank you so much. Thank you for all of your help as well. And yeah, we'll see you soon. Take care.
Thanks a lot. Yeah, hopefully we'll see you in Birmingham at some point once we're out of the pandemic. Thanks.
Yes,
good to talk to all of you.
Sounds good. All right. Bye, everyone.
Bye.